Well, good evening, everybody. For those of you I haven't met, my name is John Farmer, and I'm the director here at the Eagleton Institute of Politics. And with me up here is Dean Ambar. Dean is an associate professor of political science here at Rutgers in his third year here, and is also a senior scholar here at Eagleton in the Institute of the American Governor. He's the author of 3 prior books, one called American Cicero, a biography of Mario Cuomo, one on the role of the American governor in shaping the presidency, and one on Malcolm X at Oxford Union. But tonight we're here to talk about his new book, Reconsidering American Political Thought, A New Identity. So welcome, Dean, and look forward to this conversation. I guess I'll start by asking you, is this a departure from your prior work, or does it build on it? And what's the inspiration for this particular departure?
Well, first let me thank you for hosting this, and Eagleton and my friends and colleagues, and good to see former students and friends. I was asked to write this book. A woman who was working with Westview Press, I guess read my CV and thought, oh, we could use someone to write a textbook in American political thought. Westview Press got subsumed by Rutgers Press, and they extended the invitation. American political thought is not really my major field of research. I do dabble in it, do consider it important, but it hasn't been something that's been an area of expertise. Maybe you'll feel that way after reading the book as well.
I can tell you this, as far as I'm concerned, the book has been flight tested. I read it on the red eye over to Paris a few weeks ago, and on the flight home, and it passed the test. So it's a very engaging historical account of the development of American political thought and the gaps in American political thought. And you actually start the book with a quote from a French philosopher saying that essentially that forgetting and even getting things wrong are essential to nation building. And why did you pick that quote, and how does it inform the rest of the book?
I think when we think about the history of nations, we have to recognize, as Ernest Renan recognized, that there's a kind of level of brutality in their creation, whether it's removal, genocide, war, some form of conflict. You may remember the Roman insignia of the 2 wolves, right? That it was it Romulus who destroys or defeats and kills his brother Remus, right? Is that right? Okay, my Roman citizens here, so very good. And so the Romans kind of had this epic vision of themselves, but at least they were cognizant of the fact that Rome somehow was created through violence, and most states tend to hide or reject that notion. They somehow arise out of the ground and are benevolent, loving creatures. And I think coming to grips with a violent past is maybe the first virtue of a democratic society.
And is that something that has been sort of lacking over the years in American political theory?
Excused, I would say. Mm-hmm. You know, and I think one of the things that I did when I was researching for this text was I looked at other textbooks in American political thought. I read a good number of them, some of which I really like, and many of those people who are my colleagues in political science I really have a high regard for, and a number of historians who write about the period, particularly the founding period. But there are also these sentences that you come across that are very apologetic, well, we didn't commit genocide against the Indians, it sort of happened, or, I don't know, you'll have to read the book, but they're very elegiac and intricate sentences, somehow excusing settler violence that were perpetuated by Europeans on this continent. But it's not only that, it's other kinds of violence that is often ignored. And I found it disturbing and not really serving the needs of a well-educated citizen body. And I thought, you should always write the book that you would want to read as an undergrad, let's say. And I thought that this was something I would want to learn more about and to also come to grips with.
Yeah, and that process, actually, the book is sort of organized in terms of historical periods, starting with the colonial period, and the gaps that you're talking about really start at the very beginning, and with the depiction of the New World as some kind of Eden the boundless promise, and sort of forgetting that it's kind of populated, right?
Yeah, there were people here. One of the things that I learned in thinking and researching this book was, coming to grips with all of the scholars of indigenous history in the United States and people that I had not read as an undergrad or even as a grad student, who explored and explained the vast networks of Native American culture and trade and sort of economic activity, the fact that there were many Native people in New England for the first 100 years, a number that Europeans did not exceed until, well into the 18th century. And so, there were a lot of people here, and something happened to them. And it's not, simply a matter of, disease, although clearly disease played an important role, but there were violent clashes and wars against the Pequot Indians, for example, right? That Melville names his ship after in Moby Dick, right? So genocide is, from the novel The Last of the Mohicans, is a subject matter that shouldn't be so strange to us as Americans. James Fenimore Cooper, if we had a novel, The Last of the Jews, right, it would raise eyebrows about that civilization or culture, right? Well, The Last of the Mohicans was the great American novel for many years, and it sort of explores the idea of what happens when we're confronted with a culture that doesn't really have a place any longer on this continent and has to make way for a new culture. So I was struck by the way the sort of literary world in some ways was ahead of the game compared to the world of political science and political thought.
And so from the same period, you have the idea of the city on the hill that emerges. And I guess the question that I had reading the book was, can you have one without the other? And in other words, was it necessary in order to have this city on the hill to exclude so many other peoples?
No, it was not. I don't know. I don't want us to, or me, or any of us, to fall into the trap to think that in order for one group of people to advance or grow, it's essential for someone else to suffer or be removed. Essential or necessary to the degree that it made possible the economic engine that would later drive the country, namely slavery. Indian removal was part of that dynamic. To be sure, but I think one of the things I was struck by in my research, and specifically in thinking about Jefferson and the other founders, there were always choices to be made. And we talked a little bit about this in your office just a moment ago. All of the great compromises in American political history, from the 3/5 Compromise to the Compromise of 1850, the Missouri Compromise, 1877. All of these compromises are moments when there is an opportunity to move the country in another direction. But people actively and consciously chose a certain kind of political advancement that expanded the rights and powers of one kind of people over others. These are conscious decisions, and we can make different kinds of conscious decisions as citizens and as a people going forward. So I don't know if that quite answers, but
yeah, that was one of the sort of the underlying themes of the book is compromise and the role that it's played. And I know in my own education, I was taught that the genius of the Constitution and of our form of government was the willingness to compromise. But as you make clear in the book, frequently, all too frequently, those compromises came at the expense of whoever wasn't in the room, namely African Americans, women, Native Americans. So what is the status of compromise? And we're in a situation now where compromise is sort of frequently criticized. What do you see the role of compromise in our system, given its history?
Well, I guess, I think the first thing we have to recognize is that even with compromise, compromise does not mean that the agreement is one of equity. It doesn't mean that both sides come away with something or something equitable. Oftentimes, and arguably, think about your own relationships, there's always some imbalance, right? There's always some side that's conceding more than the other. And I don't view the 3/5 Compromise or the so-called Great Compromise as a compromise. I view that the South won that thing. And we know they won it because they had the ability to walk away at any time, and the Northern folks did not. They were willing to say, well, you can keep that slavery for the benefit of Union. They had walk-away power. And I think for the longest period of, early period of our history, the slaveholding states and slavery won out. And so we can call it compromise, but somebody won that thing. Difference at any moment in time in a compromise, instead of thinking of it as a compromise, we should ask ourselves very cynically, maybe it's because I'm from Queens, who won? Who got more out of this? Who lost? And that doesn't mean that we, in a compromise among individuals or even among groups, that there has to be winner and losers. But historically, in our country, the huge compromises that prevented war or kept the peace, the so-called period of silence on the question of slavery, et cetera, involved, winners and losers. And we don't oftentimes, historians don't often think of the losers in that position. And we have books like The Rise of American Democracy that really kind of push to the side the fact that many people lost in that thing. And we need to be attuned to that and accept that and think about it more seriously rather than embracing that as our genius.
Yeah, the book talks a lot about, I guess, a person who embodied a lot of the contradictions here and who actually wrote that America was going to be judged based on the persistence of these contradictions. That's Thomas Jefferson. How do you, after doing this research, how do you come away with a feeling about Jefferson one way or the other?
You're asking me what my take is on Thomas Jefferson?
Yeah.
Well, it's easy to say he was complicated, and he was clearly an extraordinarily complex and complicated person. But in the end, examine your own life. In the end, you look at what the default is. What do you default back to in your relationships? What do you default back to in your work life? What is your default? Jefferson's default was the continuation of slavery, the repression of black rights. It was a default that advanced power and expansion of American power, even though ideologically and intellectually he understood slavery to be a great wrong. He understood the dangers of big government. He clearly understood that America would be a different kind of nation if it were to be an empire. But we make these internal compromises. Well, it's not really an empire, it's an empire of liberty. Maybe we can't solve this in our time, but we can make it better for the next time. So I think these sorts of, Jefferson embodies the inherent contradictions in America, the beautiful dimensions of the idea of individual liberty, of a free people, of local government, where we know our elected officials, board republics, all of those beautiful elements, I think, are rightly belong in the sort of small d democratic ethos of Jefferson. But by the same token, there's tremendous darkness and evasiveness and looking the other way throughout his life that makes him, and I don't have to tell you all this, Annette Gordon Reed, right, has written about this in her work here, but makes him an enormously important but also kind of tragic figure in our history.
It's another tragic figure in our history, but one who emerges in your book as, if there's a heroic figure in your book, I would say it's Abraham Lincoln.
Yeah.
You talk about how he sort of reconceptualized America in the Gettysburg Address and then the second inaugural speech.
Is that all we got time for that? Yeah. I think Lincoln is the most profoundly honest, not only president, one of the most profoundly honest Americans. Even when he's wrong, he's honestly wrong. And he has the capacity to change, but certainly the second inaugural address is an unimaginable address to be delivered by an American president today, to suggest that we are all responsible for this great evil that's befallen us. It's neither north nor south. It's a universal kind of condemnation of our act as a society and as a nation, as a people. And in so doing that, Lincoln has the ability, once he demands moral clarity on the issue of slavery and the historic wrong, then we can get to wishing upon ourselves a lasting peace with ourselves and all nations, right? But you can't get to that internal peace or peace in America and around the world unless you come to grips with the fact that for every drop of blood shed by the lash, another drop of blood has to be shed by the sword. And it's a kind of tragic balancing act of atonement. And so I think Lincoln asks something of us as citizens, or asks, I think it's in the present sense, yes, but also historically he asked of American citizens to come to grips with who you are. Can I invoke a Godfather scene? It's like, no Tessio, no Tessio. Very good, John. I'm thinking about that scene at the end where of Godfather 2, where Talia Shire, spoiler alert, I'm going to talk about the Godfather. Talia Shire's character, Connie, confronts the new Don, her brother, Michael Corleone, and she says to Kay, his wife, this is actually the end of the first Godfather, read the papers, that's your father, that's your husband. And it's about all the murders he's committed and so forth, read the papers. And of course, Michael tells Kay what she wants to hear. She asks him, is it true? And he looks at her, pauses dramatically, and says, no. And I kind of feel like that's what we've done in American political thought. That's what we've done in American history. We kind of paused and looked Connie in the eye, or Kay in the eye, and have said, no, that's not who we are. But Lincoln had the ability to be honest with the American people and share some dark truths. But those dark truths are the way to atonement. That's the way out of the wilderness of hagiography. It's the way out of the wilderness of self-centeredness. It's the way out of the wilderness of make America great again. It's a way out of the wilderness of we're the exceptional nation, as if no other nation has had anything to offer the world. It's the way out of that myopic view that we are the ultimate. And we get to run the 5 families like the Corleones. That's not the way to do it. So there you go. You don't even have to see The Godfather now. You should be good.
A good synopsis. So one of the in the sort of post-Civil War era, one of the issues that you talk about and was how the interests of African Americans in getting the vote was ended up being compromised against the interest of women in gaining the vote. Can you describe that dynamic?
Yeah, it never quite worked out in sync, right? Yeah. That historically, when black men get the right to vote, women are told, it's not your turn, this is about black men. And of course, though, there are instances with Indian removal and Western expansion where Western states extend the right to women before they do to black men, right? And that's in part because the idea is to bring white women out, or to allow white women to come out to the West to sort of protect the sanctity of white blood, because white men might stray and that blood might be tainted and racially tainted. And so one of the lures for bringing white women out to the West, inducing them, inciting them to come out to the West, incentivizing, whatever term you want to use, is the vote, right? That's part of it. And of course, they're also needed to be, domestic laborers, to work at home with the kids while men have the right to vote. So we get a massive expansion of the white male vote, but women aren't included in that, generally speaking, although some Western states begin to, move in that direction. So it's a mixed bag, and this is kind of this uneven thing where white women are pitted against black men and vice versa. And there are these occasions where, particularly in the abolitionist movement, where black men and white women and black women are kind of, and indigenous people are kind of pushing for some of the same things. These are powerful moments, and I allude to one of them in sort of indirectly in the Toni Morrison's novel Beloved, where the character Denver helps out Setha, and you have these 2 throwaway people who are escaping together or assisting one another. It's this beautiful metaphor, but those occasions are so rare in American political history, where you can have these disparate groups, seemingly disparate groups, come together for a common purpose. And it's a beautiful moment in that novel, and it's a beautiful, those are beautiful but rare episodes in our political history.
Yeah, I was struck by your frequent citation to works of literature and other art forms, almost as as filling the gaps that existed in political theory. Was that the thought behind that? Are they somehow ahead of political theorists in some way? in a sort of metaphorical way, or
I don't want to sound too self-serving, but it's kind of what I know. It's how I think. I think so. Let's start with that. It's the way I view the world. I view the world in part through a bit of an artistic lens, a creative lens. It's what informs me. It's what excites me. And I also think, in general, political scientists and mainstream political historians have not been very good at telling stories. Present company excluded, Mr. Baxter, great historian down in Princeton. No, I think culture, art, music has to fill in the gaps more often than not, because we've been engaged in this forgetful process. And institutionalizing forgetfulness as a kind of virtue. And, we don't see that quite the same way in cinema or in, other works of art, film, music, and so forth. So I'm drawn to it. It helps me think about history differently. And you can tell truths in literature in ways that you can't quite tell in decent conversation. It sinks in differently, it attaches to you differently. Yeah.
And I guess the example you gave earlier at the Last of the Mohicans, what political theorist in America was talking about that issue then?
Yeah, to me, I don't know. I think Melville is probably the greatest American political thinker. Part of the problem is we don't have a traditional philosophical tradition in the United States, right? Cornel West wrote a book called The American Evasion of Philosophy. Europeans, philosophy is like having a cup of coffee in the morning. It's part of what you do. That's, our philosophy is pragmatism, which is a very practical, obviously, kind of philosophy. It's less rooted in sort of some systemic thought that is architectonic and builds on itself. And, we have this world of thought. Americans are like, what's next? We're future-oriented. We're less concerned about, deep thinking. So I do think that it's been the preserve, in many ways, of our great artists, writers, people like Shirley Jackson, who I've come to love of late. Her Gothic understanding of America and American democracy and of gender relations is as informative to me as anyone else. I mean, I could read Emerson, and I enjoy my little cup of Emerson, but I think I have to, and I'm hoping that my readers will appreciate the desire to expand the horizon of what informs the way we think about American political history, the way we think about American political thought.
How does FDR stand in your assessment of American political theory and theorists and the New Deal project?
I think FDR was someone who was clearly trying to, for pragmatic reasons, but also more broadly, trying to reorder American priorities and rights, and to, in effect, establish a new order of rights that were alien to Americans, right? Namely, economic rights. And so I think his genius was that we still, in very many ways, even though they're under assault periodically, have created a kind of social welfare system of sorts that many Americans, even those who self-identify as conservative, don't want to see taken away. And he did this through an educative process, through speech making, and yes, the fireside chats, but lots of writing and teaching about American history, and the fact that we had a new kind of power, namely the power of corporations, that had to be checked in the same way that government had to be checked. I mean, this is literally what FDR says. I mean, if you fear big government, guess what? We also have big business, and that deserves as much of your attention. And so we need to create, just like we have a separation of powers and some degree of shackles upon wayward government, we need those kinds of shackles on business in order to free up human capacity. And I think that was the genius of FDR.
So I guess the movement that was most informed, I would say, by political theory, at least as it sort of emerges in the book, is the civil rights movement of the 50s and 60s, Dr. Martin Luther King, Malcolm X, and that was overtly grounded in political theory. Can you talk about that, and the emergence of the nonviolence and where they were headed with that.
Yeah,
line of
it's
thought.
in many ways it's really an amalgam of thoughts. Christian theology for sure, kind of liberation theology, but also Reinhold Niebuhr and American theology within that tradition. I think. But beyond religion, religious philosophy, there was this idea that imagine like the Enlightenment without being shackled by racism, or even Marxism without being shackled by racism, right? Because these were black thinkers, men and women, they took lots of political thought from the left, from the center, and even from the right. Thinking about people like Booker T. Washington, who was essentially a conservative, predates the modern civil rights era, but they were, viewed change unobstructed through the lens of race because they were the ones who were seeking to be emancipated. And the contradictions within a leftist tradition, within a Christian tradition that said you can't pray together, but we're all under Jesus, those contradictions they were unencumbered by, and I think there was a more of a free-spirited, just a freer approach to thinking. It was there were a lot of strains within the American civil rights movement. Bayard Rustin was, a gay communist essentially, right? So, we think about it as just the black church, which is obviously at the fore, but there are lots of political strains of political thought and nationalistic thought, obviously, within that movement as well.
And so, sort of coincident with that, the rise of that was the conservative movement, William F. Buckley Jr., and so the two strands kind of moved through time together and have, I guess, over time become polarized. How would you account for that development? So we have, on the one hand, Obama and then Trump in succession.
Yeah. Wow. Obama and Trump are both deeply American in their own way. Obama reflects the progressive pragmatism of the early 20th century. He is there's a great book, James T. Kloppenberg wrote a book called Reading Obama, and it's about sort of the influences on Obama's thinking. Obama, at heart, is really an early 20th century, I think, pragmatist, progressive thinker. And that's very American, Dewey and all of that stuff. Whereas I think Trump is a celebrity, capitalist entertainer. And I think...
Seems unmoored by any kind of political theory. I mean.
Yeah, there's no... it's like this end of Apocalypse Now where Dennis Hopper's like, I don't see any method whatsoever. Right? A couple of Apocalypse Now fans, very good. Very good. Film, DVDs at the door. But that's deeply American, right? Ironically, Obama and Trump, I think, recent years were the most admired men in America. And obviously, all presidents are going to probably have an outsized reputation and polling in that way. But I have to say, even within some of my family members who didn't vote for Trump necessarily, I'd be shocked if they did, but have a real, I think, underlying admiration for him. I was listening to Al Pacino the other day talk about The Irishman. And they asked him, what is it about gangster films and why would we keep going back to gangster films? He was like, well, people love seeing people say and do what they want. They love having people act without, regard to restraint, no license, license to do what you want. To tell people off, to be free people and to just be who they are and to just act without consequences, right? And they dress nicely and they ride big cars and people love that. And Pacino was pointing to the element of freedom and really willfulness. And that's what people admire in Trump. And I'm listening to my uncle, who's in a senior care facility now, and he's like, I think this is bad with the Democrats, with they're going after Trump, but, he's more upset about sort of what's happening around Trump than Trump himself. I think there's a lot of underlying admiration for Trump. And not to tell tales out of school, but for me it's deeply disturbing. You know, it's deeply disturbing. And I don't know quite what the corrective is for that, but these are people who ordinarily, they're not out there with the red hat on, but I think they like the defiance, the sense of power to do what you want. Democracy is not always appealing, right? You know, who wants to be restrained? Oh, put me in a corner and let's hash this out. No, you know, do whatever I want. It's reflected in rap music and hip hop. It's reflected in rock. You know, Under My Thumb. It's a part of, you know, who wants to, you know, that Mick Jagger song's not going to be a hit if it's, oh, let's sit down and compromise and have your needs in mind. No, it's Under My Thumb, right? That's the impulse that drives so much of who we are. And it's more than unfortunate, but it's real. And that's what I think sometimes popular culture, and maybe high culture, if we have it, gets at in ways that we don't always get at in traditional political science.
To what extent do you think that the Trump movement sort of harkens back to the white supremacy that has obtained for most of our history, and almost a nostalgia for that, without naming it that? And to what extent do you think it's something new?
Well, it's certainly not new. Maybe it's been underground, you know, and impolitic to say. But I think that gets to that heart of being able to say what you want. You know, there are a lot of people who would like to just say certain things at work and they can't. They'd like to say how they feel about certain people, you know, whose lifestyle is different from theirs. And Trump sort of, you know, at 6 o'clock when they cut on the news, gives them the freedom to feel that way. Gives them the right to express themselves because he's saying it and he's doing it. And look at his, you know, beautiful wife, and look at his towers that he owns, and look, he's out there making it, and he's achieving, right? And you know, in Moby Dick, there's a line where I think Melville warns about this, where he says, you know, and there's the boat is traveling through some mountains, and they're looking at the shape of the facade of the mountains or whatever, and they kind of resemble Ahab. And Melville at one point writes, yeah, there's Ahab, all are Ahab. And I think it's a bit of an admonition for Americans who are just lusting over Mexico. What can we get to next? And what can we conquer next? And what can we do next? And what can we, you know? And there's this impulse for vanity, vainglory. It's all there in who we are. Because it's pursuit, right? Pursuit of happiness. It's this trajectory to be. And I wish I could say I didn't suffer from it. I think that the beauty of writing a book like this and thinking about these things, it should make you reflect on your own life. It should make you reflect on your own politics. Should reflect on, hopefully your students reflect on themselves. Because in some way, all are Ahab. And if you don't recognize that in the deepest sense, then I'll only repeat the impulse towards Ahabism, towards Trumpism, towards, you know, vainglory and conquest. And that's not how you want to live. You close the book by quoting from The Great Gatsby and the closing lines of that book, where he says, you know, boats against the current, borne back ceaselessly into the past, and that we're constantly having to redefine our past in order to understand ourselves. Do you see us making progress toward an accurate depiction, understanding of our past? And if we get there, will we still have a country? Going back to the original quote at the beginning, is it necessary to forget in order to move forward as a country? Or do you think there's a way to move forward with a more complete understanding? Right. I don't know if it's possible to ever move forward by forgetting. I think we can grow and we can forgive. You know, South Africa had a good model with the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. You know, all you white people who did these wrongs against black people, who imprisoned, murdered, raped, tortured, guess what? We're not going to lock you up. We're not even going to fine you. Come forward and tell the truth. Just come forward and tell the truth about what you did to us. And, you know, people did. And I'm not trying to paint the picture that South Africa is, you know, Valhalla of racial equality today. But there was something to be said about exposing the lies, of saying that what happened, happened. And denial, I don't know. I've probably been to too many therapy sessions, but denial is never a good thing for a person or a nation. And if you come to grips with, if we can come to grips with our past and not just, thinking wearing a red hat is going to erase, centuries of history, then maybe we can move forward. I'm hopeful that we can. Certainly, and as I said to my students today, I have to believe in some form of progress, because there was probably a time in the not too distant past in Rutgers history where I wouldn't be a professor. Some of the students and the women wouldn't be here, and other people wouldn't be here. And so our capacity for change and to make the world better is very clear. It can be done. I don't think it's going to happen through some unconscious walk through the woods where we imagine it was all a dream.
Final question. The book really is very effective at setting forth what were the externalities in political theory. So the sort of, as you say, sort of talking away or excusing all the conduct toward African Americans and then women and Native Americans. What are those things today? What are the things that we're excusing today that we're not maybe even aware that we're doing it?
Well, and I spend a little bit of time with this, but let's talk about class. Let's talk about, socioeconomic status, and just people who have no voice in our political community. I'm thinking about people in Flint, Michigan, or Newark who are drinking bad water, and no one cares. And we've got all this money to have a space force. I'm like, do the people of Flint, can they drink good water now? Why are we having a space force? What is just a generic indifference to human suffering, whether it's at the border and kids in cages, or just the way people are forced to live when they get older. And I'm thinking about my uncle, the way people are forced to live when they get older and they don't have the resources to live a dignified life. That's socioeconomic status and power, and the sort of the general disregard for people who are suffering under the banner of you should have tried harder in high school, pull yourself up by your own bootstraps, et cetera, that kind of mantra. And we just don't have enough care and concern and compassion for people who, for whatever reason, are on the short end of the financial stick. And I think we can do better by them, and by affirmation and by proxy, do better by ourselves and our country.
All right, well, thank you. So what we're going to do now is turn to questions from the audience for 10-15 minutes, and then Dean has consented to sign books out in the foyer there after that. So just in closing my part of this, it doesn't read like a textbook. Which is for me, it's high praise. I mean, it was fascinating, engaging, challenging, a lot of preconceptions that I had, and so I would heartily recommend it to those who are here. So, having said that, any questions from the audience? There's a microphone to pass around.
So, as mentioned, we're going to move to question and answer. If you would please give me your name, where you're coming from, and please keep your questions brief so we get as many questions as we possibly can in tonight. Raise of hand for who wants to.
My name is Steve Heisler. The question I was a comment that you made earlier about the relationship between the Native American genocide and slavery. And I mean, I understand it from a philosophical point that comes out of the same idea of one person being supreme to another. I didn't understand the economic relationship that you spoke about.
Well, I'm thinking about how Indian removal, particularly in the Western territories, paved the way to an expansion, paved the way towards the extension of slavery, leading up ultimately to the Mexican-American War, right? But that the newly acquired territories after the acquisition of the Louisiana Territory meant two things. It meant, post 1832, we were going to move Indians off their land, Trail of Tears, but also that territory was going to be occupied by white settlers for the purpose of expanding slavery into those territories. And with the caveat that if you came, you'd be able to bring your slaves, right? Because of the 3630 line, the Missouri Compromise. So I guess maybe Crewley was attempting to explain the relationship between how Indian removal and slavery, but also the expansion of white male suffrage were all part of the same mix, right? And so there's this tendency to, I think, glorify without explanation, proper explanation, that period of white male suffrage expansion, but also without looking at the attendant suffering that accompanied it. That's all.
Hi, my name is Matthew Camarda, and I'm an Eagleton graduate fellow. My question is, do you think modern-day historians do a good enough job portraying and showing the extent to which the anti-slavery movement prior to the Civil War was very anti-black, and how a lot of sort of the arguments against expanding slavery westward had to do with white people not wanting black people in the West?
Some do. And by the way, I should mention that there were 3 books that really influenced from a historical point, my thinking. And there were others that influenced, but in a good way. Paul Freimer is a book out, Princeton historian, on building an American empire. That came out maybe 2 or 3 years ago. It's an exceptional book. Ibram X. Kendi's book, maybe you've heard of it. I think it's Stamped from the Beginning, A History of Racist Ideas in America. And then I just went to Jill Lepore, who I love Jill Lepore. It was just sort of a generic broad history of American politics. So some of these people do, and Freimer's book does do some of that. And I think they're also, the history of Oregon is a great story, right? Because Oregon said, slavery is terrible, we don't want it, but no black people are allowed to come settle here, right? So that's a good example of that kind of internal contradiction. But those were some of the works, and I think Freimer's recent book gets into that.
Hi, I'm Peter Anderson. I work at Rutgers, and you were mentioning about truth and reconciliation, and I think that the concepts of like fake news and that we're in a post-truth world, that undermines the possibility of truth and reconciliation, because if there is no truth, you never have to reconcile. So, what do you think?
Yeah, some of these things, I was talking to my son Luke the other day about an issue. It was sort of a political issue, but it was about some middle school heartbreak he was experiencing. And I basically said, Luke, you're not going to be able to solve this problem. You can't solve all of this, right? Do what you need to do, bro. You're not going to be able. And I think what I'm suggesting is that in our own way here at Eagleton, you in your own life, me in my own life, and in small pockets, the kind of idealized version of what I think Jefferson wanted, small d democratic forces. That's how we're going to get at this thing. We can push for big national change and try to change globally mindsets. But I do think the best thing we can do is, in our own practice and in our own professions and in our own way, push to be truthful and to try to reconcile and to try to be better and more democratic. And when we have the opportunity to not, like Starbuck aboard the Pequod, just kind of, sheath our sword and say, well, that's just, I tried. We got to do better than that.
Hello, my name is Danny. I'm a current student. And to touch point on doing better, institutions like Rutgers, Eagleton is very elite. Capitalism runs. How is it possible to get your book to the hands of those that probably can't afford it, or pass down the knowledge to the people who really need to be exposed or don't have the opportunity? Even in higher education institutions, trying to get into these spaces, they're not catered to students who may not look predominantly white or are not males. So in the world that we're moving, as we're trying to change and really talk about democracy and really understanding the political history of the United States, how in a way can we also be able, or an institution like Eagleton and Rutgers, pass down a book like yours that's not a textbook into the hands of those that may need it or may want to, but financially speaking can't afford it?
Thank you for that question. I think part of the challenge is obviously the book publishing industry. They're charging a slim volume like this. It's not inexpensive to buy this book, in part because it's not with a trade press, right? But the longer answer to your question, maybe the better answer to your question, is about people in academia. And I do think this is Eagleton's mission, is to produce public intellectuals, right? Polling and research and events that speak to the public. And so at a minimum, you can, believe this is free, right? This is free and open, right, to the public. We can do these kinds of events. People like me can, I remember what was instructive to me was Cornel West, whose honorarium is pretty high. I don't know if y'all know what he gets per speech. But I remember I taught at Princeton High School for years, and I remember Cornel West showing up to the high school, and am I right or not, fellas? And, packed it out. He didn't charge anything. Kwame Appiah of NYU, formerly of Princeton, came. I think it's the job of professors and other people who are writing and teaching to make themselves available to the public, and to the best of our ability to make our writing open access and available to the public. That should be part of our mission, rather than just, dare I say, writing journal articles that a handful of our colleagues read that may promote us, but don't really advance the kind of discourse that I think needs to take place nationally, more publicly.
Yeah, I'm not familiar with what's going on undergrad at Rutgers here, but I was dean of the law school for a while, and we actually raised money to purchase textbooks for the kids who couldn't afford it, because it's one of the highest costs of going to school. The textbooks, they're extraordinarily expensive. So there are programs like that in various pockets, and it's a question of finding them, but they do exist.
Hi, my name's Daniel Burke. I'm a current student here. I just wanted to go back to what you said about like Obama against like Trump, if you would, about how people have a weird like admiration for like speaking and acting on impulse. In a way, would you possibly consider like acting on impulse like a threat to American thought and democracy?
I think definitionally democracy is about deliberation, right? I mean, it's about discourse, parliamentarianism, right? Woodrow Wilson criticized parliaments because so many talking shops, right? That kind of thing. Democracy requires deliberation and contemplation and time, right? That's why the Greeks had slaves. It took too much damn time, right? So the women were sequestered and there was slavery, right? Michael Hanchard writes about this in sort of his history of race recently. I do think that's why the Anti-Federalists, and really the founders in general, really reflected a lot on the idea of civic virtue and personal virtue that had to accompany any self-government, any system of self-government. Because the tendency is towards impulse, but that doesn't work well with democracy. So we had to produce, and still have to produce, more virtuous citizens. That means that the job of democracy is not just voting, it's working on ourselves. And it means being more reflective citizens, more reflective people, less impulsive, more inclined towards democracy. And all of this makes democracy that much more challenging. It's easier to give into the Putinism, the Ahabism, the Trumpism in your soul. That's easy, right? It's another thing to take a step back and be more reflective. And I think our greatest small d Democrats in this country really have been through, like Lincoln, FDR, been through periods of suffering. And that suffering has bred a kind of self-reflection that they wouldn't otherwise had. If you're FDR and it's 1910 and you can walk and you're hot and everybody loves you and you're under Secretary of State. You didn't know FDR was hot?
I'm sure in his day
Dude
he
was totally hot. But if everything's working for you and you're a millionaire and you're FDR, but he said he probably would not have become FDR had he not gone through that physical crisis that he went through and experienced. And hopefully we can learn enough without having to experience that level of suffering to be better, but democracy requires greater reflection. It asks more of us as people than authoritarian societies ask. They say, follow the rules, that's plenty, you're doing great. In a democracy, we have to do more than that.
Hello, my name is Sarah Akenazar. I'm an environmental policy student right now. And earlier you had referred to the very serious water quality issue in towns like Newark and towns like Flint. And I just noticed that oftentimes places that are often like places of color and places that have like more like working class, blue collar people tend to be affected by issues in the environment disproportionately. And so this has kind of been like a recurring theme throughout history of like building landfills in places that are poor or dumping toxic waste in places that are poor or people of color that live there. So how do we end the cycle? You know, how do you I guess, encourage people from those places to like get involved in politics to help change the way things are in their communities?
Yeah, thanks for the question. I think it's an unfortunate but perennial demand that's placed upon working class and poor people to be their own advocates when they should have elected advocates for their plight. But nothing changes in America or anywhere without resistance, without agitation, without pressure and protest and movement. And I wish I could say that out of the kindness of their hearts, people will one day wake up in these municipalities or states and say, well, this is just the right thing to do. That's rare. We have instances, there are heroic instances, moments where people like a Bobby Kennedy's in the Mississippi Delta in 1968 and advocating for poor people. It's few and far between. What really prompts that is social movement by people who are letting their voices be heard, making their voices be heard. And that involves, traditional politics, it involves protest, it involves movement, so that their voices can be heard. And that's the theme running through our history, is that whenever there's been an advancement of any kind, it's because people have demanded that their voices be heard, and then leaders follow. And it's not fair. It shouldn't be that way. It's not right, but it is the reality of our political system that has historically tilted towards the wealthy and the privileged, and we can't expect that to change. We have to be the forces that make it change in the best way we can as individuals.
Any further?
Final question.
Hello, my name is Steven Ferralis. I'm a sophomore at the Poli-Sci department. It's certainly true that a lot of Americans who don't necessarily support Trump glorify him. They see him as perhaps the personification of the American dream. Do you think that's the issue? Do you think we have to redefine, at this crucial moment in our history, what an American dream has to be like in order to move forward?
It's a heavy question. It's a heavy question.
Good one to end on.
Yeah, it is. Yeah, it's probably because I'm turning 50 or have turned 50. But so I think a lot about what makes a successful life, what makes a good life, what makes a happy life, right? And I think, the idea of this sort of acquisitiveness and conquest and, creation of wealth, it is a never-ending quest. I don't know if Trump ever sat down for more than 10 minutes without being unhappy because there was someone not, performing some kind of act of adulation for him and so forth. So I think we do need to redefine what it means to be not only a successful country, but what it means to be happy individuals, what it means to be fulfilled individuals, for sure. And so please don't wait until you turn my age to do that. You should try to reflect on that now. But there is something to be said for being rather than doing and achieving all the time. And that's it.
All right, please join me in thanking Professor Ambar.